Hello, PEI. Ready for a deep dive into something truly iconic about this beautiful island? We're talking about those stunning historic lighthouses that dot the coastline.
Yeah, you know what's fascinating about lighthouses, especially here on PEI, is how they've adapted over time. It's amazing. They tell a tale of ingenuity and resilience and a deep connection to the sea.
Okay, so before we zero in on PEI, let's set the stage a little bit. What were those very first lighthouses in North America like? Paint us a picture.
Imagine, North America before lighthouses. Can you imagine ships trying to navigate those coastlines in the dark? Incredibly dangerous. Early lighthouses, like the ones at Boston Harbor and Lewisburg, were literally lifesavers. Marked a huge step forward in maritime safety, for sure. It's interesting to note that the oldest surviving one in North America is actually pretty close to PEI in Nova Scotia, the Sambro Island Lighthouse, built way back in 1758.
Wow, 1758. Now, PEI's first lighthouse pops up much later, right? 1845, that's the Point Prim Lighthouse, and it was built with island bricks, which, as I understand it, wasn't the best idea.
You're right, and this is where that theme of adaptation really comes in. PEI doesn't have a lot of natural building stones, so they used what they had at hand, those bricks, but they quickly realized that brick wasn't durable enough, just not durable enough to withstand the harsh weather conditions here.
So what do? Switch materials.
Exactly. They started using timber framing instead. It was readily available, of course, thanks to PEI's abundant forests and the island's expertise in shipbuilding. Plus, it proved to be much more resilient in the long run.
So we've got these early lighthouses, often made of wood. What was life actually like for the lighthouse keepers and their families back then?
It was a solitary life, often very demanding. Imagine being responsible for keeping that light burning brightly no matter what the weather was like. Keepers had to meticulously maintain the light, keep those detailed logs, and battle some pretty ferocious storms. Their families were often right there alongside them, helping with the tasks. And think about the evolution of the technology they used. I mean, from simple oil lamps and mirrors to the development of those incredible Fresnel lenses, and eventually the switch to electric lights. What a transformation.
Speaking of transformation, let's talk about the shift in the actual design of the lighthouses. We go from those early circular and octagonal structures to the square, tapered towers that have become so characteristic of PEI. What prompted that change?
You're absolutely right. The West Point Lighthouse, built in 1875, marks that shift. Joseph Tomlinson, the first lighthouse engineer for the Department of Marine, really championed these square, timber-framed towers. They were much more cost-effective to build and a lot easier to construct.
Okay, but why the square shape? Was there some advantage to that, or was it purely practical?
Well, both, actually. These pyramidal or pepper pot lighthouses, as they're sometimes called, were particularly well-suited to act as harbor or range lights. They would build them in pairs, one taller than the other, and aligning the two lights vertically provided a clear path for ships entering harbors or navigating those tricky channels.
It's like an early GPS system, just using 2 points of light. Amazing. It really makes you realize how vitally important these lighthouses were for the island's development, both economically and in terms of safety. But time marches on, technology keeps evolving. What's the state of PEI's lighthouses today? Do they still serve the same purpose?
It's a mix of preservation and adaptation, really. Some, sadly, have been abandoned or repurposed for other uses. Others remain vital aids to navigation, although their roles have definitely shifted. Larger vessels rely more on electronic systems these days, so the romantic image of the solitary keeper is largely a thing of the past. Automation has taken over in many cases.
Still, it seems like the allure of lighthouses remains strong. They're such powerful symbols of safety and resilience and a connection to our maritime heritage. They're just beautiful to look at, too. And speaking of beautiful lighthouses, we have to mention someone who really helped us shine a light on this topic, Mike Montague. Not only did he provide us with some invaluable research for this deep dive, but he actually got married at the Soaries Lighthouse.
Wow.
How cool is that? And Mike and his wife Sherry are huge fans of PEI's lighthouses.
It is pretty cool. It really speaks to the enduring appeal of these structures. They're not just relics of the past. There's still places where memories are made and love stories unfold.
Exactly. And Mike's insights have been so helpful in understanding the fascinating history and significance of these coastal sentinels. So for our listeners who might be inspired to explore PEI's lighthouses themselves after this deep dive, what advice would you give them? Where should they start?
I would say embrace the journey. Each lighthouse offers a unique perspective on the island's history and culture. Take your time, soak in the atmosphere, and imagine the lives of the keepers and their families who once called these places home.
That's great advice. And don't forget to bring your camera. The photo opportunities are endless.
Absolutely. From those dramatic coastal vistas to the intricate architectural details, there's something to capture everyone's imagination.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already in this deep dive into PEI's lighthouses. But before we move on, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, the decline in the number of active lighthouses across Canada. What factors have contributed to this trend? Is it purely about technology?
It's definitely a combination of technological advancements and changes in maritime practices. The advent of GPS and other electronic navigation systems has been huge. Ships can now pinpoint their location with incredible accuracy, which reduces their reliance on visual aids like lighthouses. Additionally, the trend toward larger cargo ships and more centralized ports has shifted shipping traffic away from some of the smaller coastal routes where lighthouses were once absolutely essential.
So it's a classic case of technology changing the landscape, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And while it's understandable that the practical need for lighthouses has diminished, it's so important to recognize their historical and cultural value. That's why efforts to preserve and repurpose these structures are so crucial.
Absolutely. They're not just navigational aids, they're tangible links to our past, reminders of a time when life on the coast was intimately connected to the rhythms of the sea.
Beautifully put. And as we move further into the digital age, it's more important than ever to cherish these physical reminders of our maritime heritage. They offer a sense of grounding and perspective in a world that's constantly changing.
So true. Well said. Now, before we get too deep into that philosophical territory, let's shift gears a bit and delve into the evolution of lighthouse technology itself, because that's a whole fascinating story on its own.
You mentioned the evolution of lighthouse technology, and that's a really fascinating aspect of their history. Think about it. We started with simple fires and mirrors, right? Then we moved to oil lamps and these intricate lenses, and now we have, incredibly powerful electric lights.
It's amazing how the technology developed alongside the lighthouses themselves.
Yeah.
What were those early lighting systems actually like?
Well, those early lighthouses relied on open fires or basic oil lamps, right? And to amplify that light, they needed these large reflectors, often made of polished metal. Can you imagine having to constantly clean and maintain those reflectors in a cramped lantern room high above the ground?
That sounds like a tough job. And I bet those early lights weren't very effective, especially in foggy conditions.
You're absolutely right. Their range was limited by, well, the technology of the time, right? Then came a real game changer, the Fresnel lens.
I've heard of those. They look so intricate. What makes them so special?
The Fresnel lens, named after its inventor, Augustin Jean Fresnel, was a revolutionary breakthrough. It uses this complex arrangement of prisms to focus the light into a powerful beam, dramatically increasing the distance from which a lighthouse could be seen.
It's incredible how one invention could have such a profound impact on maritime safety.
It really is. The Fresnel lens became the standard for lighthouses around the world. And because it was so much more efficient, it allowed for the construction of taller and more powerful lighthouses, which further increased their range, you see.
And then eventually came the switch to electric lights. I imagine that was another huge leap forward.
Absolutely. Electric lights were brighter, more reliable, and required far less maintenance than oil lamps. This transition to electric lights also had a big influence on lighthouse design. There was no longer this need for those large lantern rooms or these complex fuel storage systems.
It's fascinating to see how each technological advancement shaped not just the lights themselves, but the entire structure of the lighthouses. But lighthouses aren't just about the technology, are they? They seem to hold this special place in our collective imagination, too.
You've hit the nail on the head. Lighthouses have this incredible symbolic power. They've been the subject of countless paintings, poems, songs, and films, right? They're often seen as these symbols of hope and guidance and steadfastness. Standing tall against the elements, they represent the enduring power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit, I think.
There's definitely a romantic element to them, too. That image of the lone lighthouse keeper bravely keeping watch over the stormy seas has captured people's imaginations for centuries.
I agree. There's a certain mystique surrounding lighthouses and the people who tended them. They were often seen as these solitary figures, living on the edge of the world, yet connected to all those who relied on their light for safety.
I think that sense of connection is part of what makes lighthouses so enduringly appealing, don't you think? They represent a link between land and sea, between the known and the unknown.
Beautifully said. They remind us of our dependence on the natural world and the importance of respecting its power, right? And in a world that's increasingly dominated by technology, I think lighthouses offer this sense of grounding and perspective that we crave.
Absolutely. They represent a time when life was simpler, yet also more challenging. A time when people relied on their ingenuity and courage to navigate the world. Speaking of those challenges, let's delve into the specific difficulties faced by lighthouse keepers here on PEI. What were some of the unique aspects of their lives and work?
As we discussed earlier, isolation was a huge factor. PEI's coastline, with all its small inlets and bays, meant that many lighthouse keepers and their families lived in very remote locations, often miles from the nearest town or village.
I can only imagine how difficult that must have been, especially during the long winter months when storms could make travel impossible.
Exactly. Keepers had to be incredibly self-sufficient, relying on their own skills and resources to survive. They often kept gardens, raised livestock, and fished to supplement their supplies.
It sounds like a life that demanded a tremendous amount of resilience and adaptability.
It absolutely did. And it wasn't just the physical challenges either, right? The mental and emotional toll of that isolation could be pretty significant, I imagine. Keepers had to contend with loneliness and boredom and the constant threat of danger from storms, shipwrecks, even fires.
It's a stark reminder that behind that romantic image of the lighthouse keeper was a life of real hardship and sacrifice.
Indeed. And it's so important to acknowledge the contributions of the keepers' families as well, right? Their wives and children often played a vital role in maintaining the lighthouse and supporting the keepers' work.
I've even heard stories of wives taking over the keeper's duties when their husbands were ill or injured.
That's right. There are many inspiring accounts of women who bravely stepped up to keep the lights burning, ensuring the safety of ships at sea.
Those women were true heroes in their own right. Their dedication and courage deserve to be remembered and celebrated.
Absolutely. They were such an integral part of the lighthouse community. Now let's shift our focus to the present day. What's the current state of PEI's lighthouses? How have they fared in this age of modern technology?
We've already touched on the fact that the role of lighthouses has diminished with the advent of GPS and other navigational tools. Has that trend affected PEI's lighthouses as well?
Unfortunately, yes. Many of the island's lighthouses have been decommissioned in recent decades, as their primary function in maritime navigation has become less critical, I guess.
That's understandable, but it's a bit sad to think about those lighthouses no longer serving their original purpose.
I agree. But the good news is that there's been a growing movement to preserve and repurpose these historic structures.
So they're not just being left to crumble. That's encouraging. What are some of the ways they're being given a new lease on life?
There's a growing recognition that lighthouses are more than just navigational aids. They're important cultural landmarks that tell the story of PEI's maritime heritage. And people are finding these creative ways to give them new life. Some have been converted into museums, offering visitors a glimpse into the past and showcasing the history of lighthouse keeping.
That makes sense. I could see them being fascinating museums. What other kinds of transformations are happening?
Some have been turned into art galleries, studios, even restaurants, and others have become unique and charming accommodations, offering guests the opportunity to actually experience, life in a lighthouse.
Wow. Spending the night in a lighthouse. That would be an incredible experience. It seems like while the traditional role of lighthouses may be fading, they're finding new ways to connect with people and even contribute to the island's economy.
Exactly. It shows that these structures still hold a special place in our hearts and that we're committed to preserving them for future generations.
It's a testament to the power of community involvement and the dedication of individuals and organizations who are working tirelessly to protect these iconic landmarks. We've talked about the broader trends, but now let's get into some specifics. For visitors to PEI who are eager to see these lighthouses for themselves, which ones would you recommend? What are some of your favorites?
That's a tough question. There are so many beautiful and historic lighthouses on PEI, but I suppose I'd have to start with the Prim Lighthouse, which, as you mentioned earlier, is the oldest surviving one on the island.
It's a classic example of those early brick lighthouses, isn't it? It must have some incredible stories to tell.
It does, and its location on a peninsula jutting out into Hillsborough Bay offers stunning views of the surrounding coastline.
It sounds picturesque.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that comes to mind is a West Point Lighthouse. We talked about how it marked that shift in design towards those square tapered towers.
Yes. The West Point Lighthouse is a beautiful example of that architectural style. And what's unique about it is that it has a reconstructed keeper's dwelling. Visitors can tour the dwelling and get a real sense of what life was like for a lighthouse keeper and his family in the late 19th century.
Wow, so you can actually step back in time. And of course, we can't forget the Souris Lighthouse. It has a special connection to this episode, right?
Indeed. The Souris Lighthouse holds a special place in our hearts because, well, that's where our friend Mike Montague got married.
It's a truly romantic spot. I've seen pictures. It's so picturesque, with those red and white stripes perched overlooking Colville Bay.
And it's also known for a rather unusual feature, an exterior staircase that wraps around the tower.
It's no wonder it's a popular spot for photos. I bet the views from up there are breathtaking.
Absolutely. You can see the whole eastern end of the island from up there. Now, for those interested in the more technical side of lighthouses, the Wood Islands Lighthouse is a must-see.
I've heard it has an impressive collection of those Fresnel lenses on display. Is that right?
It does. Visitors can see those intricate lenses up close and learn all about how they revolutionized lighthouse technology. And it's one of the few lighthouses on PEI that still has its original keeper's dwelling intact.
Oh, wow. So you get the history of the technology and glimpse into the keeper's life as well.
Exactly. The dwelling has been restored to its 19th century appearance, offering a truly immersive experience.
These are just a few examples of the many wonderful lighthouses that await visitors to PEI. It sounds like there's something for everyone, whether you're interested in history or architecture or just soaking in the beauty of the coastline. But before we wrap up our exploration of PEI's lighthouses, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office, or FHBRO. They play a role in assessing and designating lighthouses, right?
That's right. FHBRO plays a crucial role in identifying and protecting Canada's built heritage, and that includes its lighthouses.
So can you tell us a bit more about what they do and why their work is so important?
Of course. FHBRO is responsible for evaluating and designating federal heritage buildings. These buildings represent a wide range of architectural styles and historical periods. They include everything from government offices and courthouses to railway stations and, of course, lighthouses.
It sounds like they have a big job. How do they decide which buildings to designate? What are their criteria?
Well, they use a set of criteria to assess a building's historical, architectural, and environmental significance. They look at things like the building's age, its design, its connection to important events or people, and its contribution to the character of its community.
It's about preserving those tangible links to our past. So once a building is designated, what happens? What does that mean for the building?
It means that the building is officially recognized as having national historic significance, and it's protected from demolition or alteration without FHBRO's approval.
So it's a way of ensuring that these important landmarks are preserved for future generations to appreciate and learn from.
Exactly, and it's a recognition of the value that these buildings hold, not just for their historical and architectural merit, but also for their cultural and social significance.
And in the case of lighthouses, it's a way of honoring the legacy of the keepers and their families who dedicated their lives to maintaining these vital aids to navigation. It's important work. Now, looking ahead, what do you see as the future of PEI's lighthouses? What challenges and opportunities do they face in the 21st century?
Well, as we've discussed, the biggest challenge is the continued decline in their traditional role as navigational aids, right? With modern technology, ships are much less reliant on those visual cues. But that doesn't mean lighthouses have lost all relevance. They still serve as important visual markers, for smaller boats and recreational craft. And they continue to hold, a powerful symbolic significance for coastal communities.
It's that enduring appeal we were talking about earlier. So even if their practical function has diminished, their cultural value remains strong. And you mentioned that there's this growing trend towards repurposing lighthouses for new uses, right?
Exactly. This trend presents a real opportunity to breathe new life into these historic structures and ensure their long-term sustainability. Instead of being abandoned, they can be transformed into these vibrant community spaces.
So how can we ensure that PEI's lighthouses continue to thrive in the years to come? What can be done to support them?
I think ongoing awareness of their historical and cultural significance is crucial. We need to make sure that future generations understand the importance of these structures and the role they played in shaping PEI's coastal communities. Education is key.
Absolutely. And what about practical support? Are there organizations doing good work in that area?
There are. Organizations like the Prince Edward Island Lighthouse Society are dedicated to preserving and promoting the island's lighthouses. They do incredible work raising funds, maintaining the lighthouses, and offering educational programs and tours. They're a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to learn more about these fascinating structures.
It sounds like they're really making a difference. And of course, we can all do our part by simply visiting the lighthouses, supporting local businesses, and spreading the word about the importance of preserving our maritime heritage.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. And by working together, we can ensure that these beacons of light continue to shine brightly for many years to come.
Well said. It's been an incredible journey exploring the history, architecture, and human stories behind these iconic structures.
I agree. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
And a huge thanks again to Mike Montague of RE/MAX Charlottetown for his invaluable research assistance and for sharing his passion for PEI's lighthouses with us.
Indeed. Mike's enthusiasm is truly inspiring.
Mike's like a lighthouse himself, guiding people through the sometimes foggy world of real estate.
That's a great analogy.
So for you, dear listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked a curiosity to learn more about the lighthouses that grace our coastlines, each with its own unique tale to tell.
Perhaps it will even inspire a visit to one someday. You never know what stories you might uncover.
Until our next deep dive, keep exploring and stay curious.